I've spent more years than I care to count looking into the eyes of people who think they can outsmart the truth. It started on the streets of Chicago, wearing a blue uniform, walking beats where a lie wasn't just a social faux pas, it was a survival tactic. I've had guys with blood on their hands tell me they were miles away, and I've had people look at a smoking gun and tell me it wasn't theirs. You develop a certain kind of sense for it after a while. It's not a superpower. It's just what happens when you spend decades dealing with the worst parts of human nature. You stop listening to the words and you start watching the eyes, the hands, the way the sweat beads on a forehead when the pressure starts to climb. People think they're unique. They think their story is the one that's finally going to fool Steve Wilkos. They come onto my stage thinking they can charm me or shout me down or play the victim themselves. But I've seen it all. I've heard every excuse in the book. I've heard about the bad childhoods, the misunderstandings, the it wasn't what it looked like speeches. And frankly, I'm done with it. I lost my patience for that kind of garbage a long time ago. When you've stood over a victim, when you've seen the damage that a lie can cause, you don't have room in your heart for the person who caused it. You just want the truth. You want a clear line between right and wrong because in this world, that line is the only thing keeping us from falling into total chaos. This guy today, Marcus, he walked onto my stage with a chip on his shoulder the size of a mountain. I could see it the moment he stepped out from behind the curtain. He didn't walk, he strutted. He had that look, that arrogant, untouchable smirk that usually belongs to someone who thinks they've covered their tracks perfectly. He was accused of something that makes my blood boil. It wasn't just a simple disagreement. It was about a woman named Elena and her 5-year-old son. Elena sat there, trembling, showing me photos of bruises that no child should ever have. She told me Marcus was the only one with him. Marcus, on the other hand, sat there with his arms crossed, leaning back like he owned the place, telling me she was crazy, that the kid fell, that he was being framed. I've heard the he fell story 1,000 times. Kids fall, sure. But kids don't fall in a way that leaves finger marks on their upper arms. They don't fall in a way that creates a pattern of abuse that stretches back months. I looked at him while Elena was crying, and he didn't even glance her way. He just kept looking at the audience, looking at the cameras, trying to play the part of the wrong man. He thought he was the toughest guy in the room. He thought because he was big, because he had a loud voice and a mean stare, that I was going to back down. He didn't realize that I've stared down people a lot scarier than him in alleys where there were no cameras and no security guards to jump in. I asked him a simple question. I asked him if he loved that little boy. He didn't answer right away. He paused, looked at me with this cold, dead expression, and said, I do what I got to do to keep my house in order. That right there, that's a red flag that screams at me. It's not about love, it's about control, it's about power. People like Marcus don't see people, they see objects they can manipulate. I started pushing him. I wanted to see how deep that arrogance went. I asked him about the specific night in question, the night the neighbors heard the screaming. He started getting agitated. His leg began to bounce. The smirk was still there, but it was tighter now, more of a grimace. He started talking over me, trying to control the narrative. You don't know me, Steve. You don't know my life, he kept saying. He was right about one thing. I didn't know his life, but I knew his type. I've handcuffed his type. I put his type in the back of my squad car and watched them cry once the reality of a jail cell hit them. But here, on my stage, he felt safe. He felt like it was all just a show. He didn't understand that, for me, this isn't a performance. It's an extension of the oath I took years ago to protect those who can't protect themselves. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Elena was sobbing now, the kind of deep, gut-wrenching sobs that come from a mother who knows she failed to protect her child and is terrified of the monster sitting 5 feet away from her. Every time she made a sound, Marcus would roll his eyes. He actually had the nerve to scoff at her pain. I felt that heat rising in my chest, that familiar burn when I see a bully in action. I stood up and walked over to him. I didn't get in his face yet. I wanted to give him enough rope to hang himself with. I asked him if he'd take the polygraph. He didn't even hesitate. Give me the damn test, he said. I'll prove she's a liar. That's the thing about the truly delusional ones. They think they can beat the machine. They think their own belief in their lies is strong enough to trick a physiological response. Or maybe they just think they're so intimidating that even the results won't matter. He went backstage to take that test, and I spent that time talking to Elena. I promised her that if he did this, he wasn't going to get away with it. Not on my watch. I've seen women stay with men like this out of fear, and I wanted her to know that the fear ends today. When he came back out after the test, the atmosphere changed. The arrogance was still there, but it was defensive now. He was pacing. He was barking at my producers. He was trying to act like the test was a joke. I walked out with that envelope in my hand. That envelope is the moment of truth. It's the equalizer. It doesn't care about how loud you shout or how big your muscles are. It just tells the story of what your heart and your lungs did when you were asked the hard questions. Marcus was staring at me, his chest puffed out, trying to look me down. I could see the sweat on his neck. I could see the way his hands were balled into fists. He was trying to intimidate me before I even opened the paper. He wanted to make me think twice about calling him out. Little did he know, intimidation is a language I've been fluent in since before he could walk, and I don't respond to it the way he wants me to. I looked him dead in the eye, took a breath, and prepared to tear his world down. I told him to sit down. He didn't want to. He wanted to stand over me. I've had men try to tower over me many times. It's a classic power move. They think if they occupy more space, they win. I just looked at him and said it again. Sit down. There was something in my voice, the cop voice, that made him hesitate. He sat, but he sat on the very edge of the chair, ready to spring. He started rambling before I could even speak. That guy back there, that tester, he didn't know what he was doing. He was trying to trip me up. He was asking the questions wrong. This whole thing is a setup. The excuses were already starting, and I hadn't even read the results yet. That's how you know they failed. They start attacking the process before the outcome is even revealed. I let him talk. I let him dig that hole deeper and deeper. I looked at Elena, who was holding her breath, her eyes fixed on that manila envelope. She needed this. She needed the world to know she wasn't the crazy one. She needed the validation that would give her the strength to walk away for good. Marcus saw me looking at her, and he snapped. What you looking at her for? She's the one who's been lying to you, Steve. She's the one who hits that kid. The projection was staggering. To sit there and blame the victim while your own guilt is literally written on the paper in my hand, it's a level of cowardice that I will never get used to. I looked down at the paper. I didn't need to read it twice to know what it said. The results were screaming off the page in black and white. When you've done this as long as I have, you can almost feel the failure before you even slide the results out of the envelope. I looked at Marcus. He was still vibrating with that fake manufactured energy, trying to stare me down, trying to look like a man who had nothing to hide. I let the silence hang for a second. I wanted him to feel the weight of it. I wanted the audience to see the exact moment the mask started to slip. I cleared my throat, not taking my eyes off him, and I told him straight. I told him he was lying. I told him the polygraph showed deception on every single question regarding the physical abuse of that little boy. I told him the machine caught him red-handed. The reaction was instantaneous. He didn't even wait for me to finish the sentence. He stood up so fast his chair flew backward, clattering against the floor. He didn't just stand, he lunged toward me, his face turning a deep, ugly shade of purple. He started screaming at the top of his lungs, a wall of noise designed to drown out the truth I had just spoken. You're a liar, that machine is a lie, you're trying to set me up. He was stepping into my personal space, his chest puffed out, his fists clenched at his sides. He thought he could physically overwhelm the situation. He thought if he got loud enough and scary enough, I'd take a step back. He didn't realize who he was dealing with. I've had guys pull knives on me in dark hallways. I've had people threaten my family. A guy shouting on a television set doesn't move the needle for me. I stood my ground, my feet planted, looking him right in those bloodshot eyes. I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I just watched him unravel. Security moved in, of course. My guys are the best in the business, and they were on him in a heartbeat, creating a wall between him and me, and more importantly, between him and Elena. But Marcus wasn't stopping. He was straining against them, trying to push through, pointing a finger at me that was shaking with rage. I'll see you outside, Steve. You think you're so tough behind those guards? I'll show you what's real. That's the classic move of a man who has lost everything else. When the lie fails, when the charm fails, when the manipulation is exposed, all they have left is the threat of violence. It's the ultimate admission of guilt. If you were innocent, you'd be devastated. You'd be crying. You'd be begging for someone to listen to your side. You wouldn't be trying to start a fight with the guy holding the results. I looked past him at Elena. She had shrunk back into her seat, her hands over her mouth, watching the man she thought she loved turn into the monster she had described to me backstage. This was the reality she lived with every day. This wasn't a show for her. This was the terror of her domestic life played out under studio lights. Seeing her fear only made me angrier. I told the guards to let him go for a second, not to let him hit me, but to let him stand on his own 2 feet so I could talk to him man to man. I stepped closer, right into the heat of his anger. I told him to look at her. I told him to look at the woman he claimed to love and see what he had done to her. He didn't want to look. He kept his eyes on me, his breath smelling of stale coffee and nervous adrenaline. "You don't know nothing," he spat, his voice cracking. I told him I knew exactly what he was. I've seen his type in every precinct I ever worked in. He's a bully who picks on people smaller than him because it makes him feel powerful. He hits a 5-year-old boy because a 5-year-old can't hit back. He intimidates a woman because he's too much of a coward to face the world as an equal. I told him that his tough guy act was pathetic. I told him that the only reason he was shouting was because he was terrified. He was terrified that the world finally saw him for the small, weak man he really is. He didn't like that. He tried to surge forward again, barking insults, calling me names I've been called 1,000 times before. It didn't affect me. When you know you're standing on the side of the truth, the insults of a liar are like rain on a tin roof. They just make a lot of noise before they wash away. He started trying to play to the audience then, turning his head and shouting to the crowd, "You all believe this? You believe a machine?" The audience wasn't having it. They were booing him, their voices rising in a collective wave of disgust. He was losing the room, he was losing his grip, and he was losing his mind. He turned back to me, his eyes wide and wild. "I'm going to sue you. I'm going to take everything you got." I've heard that one before too. The legal threat is the last refuge of the desperate. I just laughed. I told him to go ahead. I told him I'd love to sit in a courtroom and show a jury the photos of those bruises on that little boy. I told him I'd love to have the polygraph examiner testify about how his heart rate spiked when he was asked if he struck that child. That shut him up for a split second. The mention of a courtroom, of actual consequences beyond the studio walls, always brings him back to earth, even if it's just for a moment. But the silence didn't last. He went back to the intimidation, trying to move around the security guards to get a clear path to me. He was shouting about his reputation and how I was disrespecting him. Respect. That's a word guys like Marcus love to use, but they don't have a clue what it means. They think respect is something you get by being the loudest or the meanest. They don't realize that respect is earned through character, through taking care of your family, through being a man of your word. You don't get respect by hurting kids. You get contempt. I told him that to his face. I told him he didn't deserve an ounce of respect from me, from Elena, or from anyone in that building. I told him he was a disgrace. He was sweating profusely now, his shirt sticking to his back. The bravado was starting to leak out of him, replaced by a frantic, cornered animal kind of energy. He realized he wasn't going to win this. He wasn't going to intimidate me into changing the results, and he wasn't going to win over the crowd. He was exposed. He looked at the exit, then back at me, one last sneer on his face. "This place is a joke," he mumbled, trying to regain some shred of dignity as he started to back away. I didn't let him off that easy. I followed him as he retreated. I wanted him to feel the pressure all the way to the door. I wanted him to know that there was nowhere he could go where the truth wouldn't follow him. I told him that today was the last day he was ever going to lay a hand on that boy. I told him that we were going to make sure the authorities saw everything we had. He stopped at the edge of the stage, looking back at Elena one last time. It wasn't a look of regret. It was a look of pure, unadulterated malice. It was a threat. I saw it, and I stepped in front of his line of sight, breaking the connection. "You're done with her," I said, my voice low and steady. "You look at me. Your business is with me now." He cursed at me one last time, a string of profanity that showed just how little substance there was behind his mask. He turned and stormed off the stage, kicking a piece of equipment on his way out, still trying to project strength even as he was running away. I stood there for a moment, watching the curtain close behind him, feeling the adrenaline slowly start to recede, replaced by that heavy, familiar weight of sadness for the victims left in the wake of a man like that. The curtain was still swaying from where he'd shoved past it, and the sound of his heavy boots echoing in the hallway behind the set was the only thing left of him on that stage. But I knew Marcus wasn't gone. Guys like that, they don't just vanish into the night when they're embarrassed. Their ego won't let them. They have to have the last word. They have to prove, if only to themselves, that they weren't broken. I stood there for a beat, just breathing, letting the heat in my face settle. I looked at the audience. They were stunned, some of them whispering, some of them just staring at the space where that explosion of anger had just happened. Then I looked at Elena. She was shaking so hard I thought she might fall out of the chair. That's the part people don't see on the screen, the physical toll that fear takes on a person. It's not just a feeling, it's a physiological reaction. Her body was stuck in a trauma loop, and Marcus walking off hadn't ended it. I walked over to her and knelt down. I'm a big guy, and I know I could be intimidating myself, so I made sure to keep my voice low, the way I used to talk to witnesses who were too scared to give a statement. I told her she was safe. I told her that he was never going to get near her or that boy again if I had anything to say about it. She looked at me, and I saw a flicker of something, maybe hope, maybe just exhaustion. She asked me, "What do I do now?" And that's the hardest question in the world to answer, because the show ends, the lights go down, but she has to go back to a life that Marcus has spent years trying to dismantle. I told her the truth. She had to be the wall between him and her son. I told her we had the resources to help her, to get her to a safe place, but she had to make the choice never to let that shadow back into her home. I stood up and felt that familiar itch in the back of my skull. I wasn't finished with Marcus. I could hear him backstage, still shouting, still throwing things. One of my producers came out and gave me a look, the "he's losing it back there" look. I didn't need an invitation. I headed through the curtain. The backstage area of a TV studio is a maze of cables, monitors, and crates. And right in the middle of it was Marcus, surrounded by three of my biggest security guys. He was pacing like a caged tiger, his face wet with sweat, his shirt untucked. He was still trying to play the tough guy, pointing his finger at the security team, telling them what he'd do if they weren't there to protect me. It's the oldest lie in the book. You're lucky the cops are here. No, Marcus, you're lucky the cops are here. Because the truth is a lot harder to deal with when there's nobody to stand between you and the consequences of your actions. I walked right up to the edge of the circle. He saw me, and his eyes lit up with that fake bravado again. "Oh, here he is, the big man. You think you're a hero, Steve? You're just a bully with a microphone." I let him talk. I've been called worse by better men. I waited until he ran out of breath, until he realized I wasn't going to start shouting back. I asked him a question, very calmly. I asked him how long he'd been hitting Elena. He froze. He tried to pivot back to the boy, back to the accident, but I stayed on it. I told him I saw the way she flinched when he raised his hand to point at me. I told him that kind of reaction doesn't come from one bad night. It comes from a lifestyle of fear. I told him I knew he was a domestic abuser through and through. He lunged. It wasn't a smart move. My security guys had him before he could even get a foot of ground, but the intent was there. He wanted to hurt me because I was holding up a mirror, and he hated what he saw. While they held him, I got close. I wanted him to hear me clearly over the sound of his own heavy breathing. I told him that I've spent half my life putting guys like him in cages. I told him that he wasn't special, he wasn't unique, and he certainly wasn't tough. A tough man protects the vulnerable. A tough man takes responsibility. A weak man, a coward, uses his size to silence a woman and a child. I told him he was the definition of a coward. He started crying then. Not the kind of crying that comes from remorse, but the kind of frustrated, angry tears of a child who has been told no for the first time in his life. He started blubbering about how hard his life had been, how Elena didn't understand him, how the kid was always crying and he just couldn't take it. The excuses started pouring out like a broken sewer pipe. It's always the same story. It's always someone else's fault. The world is too hard, the stress is too much, the victim provoked them. I've heard it from murderers, I've heard it from thieves, and I was hearing it from him. I didn't give him an inch. I told him I didn't care about his excuses. There are millions of people with hard lives who don't beat their families. There are men who work 3 jobs and come home and love their children. His stress wasn't a reason, it was a choice. I told him to look at the monitor on the wall. It was still showing the stage where Elena was being comforted by one of our advocates. I told him to look at what he'd done to her spirit. He looked, and for a split second, I saw a crack in the armor. I saw a moment where the reality of his own ugliness hit him. But then it was gone, replaced by that defensive snarl. He turned back to me and spat on the floor. I don't care, he said. She's nothing without me. She'll be back. They always come back. That's the most chilling part of dealing with people like Marcus. They rely on a cycle of abuse. They count on the fact that they've broken their victims down so much that the victim doesn't believe they deserve anything better. He was standing there, bragging about his ability to keep a woman trapped in a cycle of pain. I felt a surge of cold anger then, the kind that makes everything very quiet and very sharp. I told him that this time he was wrong. I told him that we were going to make sure she had every resource, every legal protection, and every bit of support she needed to make sure he never got within a mile of her again. I told him his reputation in his neighborhood was about to be trashed because everyone was going to see exactly what kind of man he was. I told him that when this show aired, he wasn't going to be the big shot on the block anymore. He was going to be the guy who failed the lie detector test for hitting a kid. He didn't have a comeback for that. He just stared at me, his mouth hanging open a little, the reality of the public exposure finally sinking in. These guys thrive in the dark. They thrive in the privacy of their own homes where there are no witnesses. When you drag them into the light, when you put their actions on a screen for millions of people to see, they wither. They can't handle the collective judgment of a society that still knows right from wrong. I told my guys to take him out the back. I didn't want him anywhere near the front of the building where he might try to wait for Elena. I watched them lead him away, his head down now, the swagger gone, replaced by the slumped shoulders of a man who knew he'd lost his power. I walked back out onto the stage. The energy had shifted. It wasn't about the confrontation anymore. It was about the aftermath. I sat down next to Elena. I didn't use the desk. I just sat in the chair next to her. I wanted to talk to her and to everyone watching about the reality of what we just saw. Because Marcus isn't just one guy. He's a representative of a problem that's in every city and every neighborhood. This idea that you can intimidate your way out of the truth. This idea that if you're loud enough and aggressive enough, people will stop asking questions. I looked into the camera and I felt the weight of all those years on the force. All those cases that didn't have a happy ending. I wanted this one to be different. I wanted people to understand that when someone shows you who they are the way Marcus just did, you have to believe them the first time. I sat there with Elena for a long time, just letting the room breathe. The audience was quiet now, but it was a heavy quiet, the kind that settles over a place after a storm has passed, but before you start picking up the pieces. I looked at the manila envelope still resting on my lap. Those results are more than just ink on paper. They are a definitive end to a long, twisted road of gaslighting and manipulation. For months, Elena had been told she was seeing things, that she was overreacting, that she was the one with the problem. Marcus used his size and his voice to drown out her intuition. That's what guys like him do. They don't just hit you, they try to rewrite your reality until you don't trust your own eyes. But the polygraph doesn't have an emotional stake in the game. It doesn't get scared when he screams. It just records the truth. I've seen this pattern so many times, it's like a script. The moment a guy like Marcus realizes the lie isn't working, he switches gears to pure intimidation. He thought if he could make me uncomfortable, if he could make the production staff nervous, we'd somehow back off. He thought his anger could negate the facts. It's a desperate, primitive tactic. It's the behavior of someone who has run out of intellectual and moral ground to stand on. When I was a cop, I'd see it in the interrogation room all the time. A suspect would be cornered by the evidence, and suddenly they'd start talking about how they know people on the outside or how they're going to find out where I live. It never worked then, and it doesn't work now. You can't intimidate the truth. It just sits there, cold and unyielding, waiting for you to get tired of shouting. I turned to Elena and I asked her if she had ever seen him that angry before. She just nodded, her eyes fixed on the floor. She told me that was a tame version of Marcus. She told me that at home, without the cameras, without the security, that anger turned into something much more focused and much more dangerous. She told me about the night he broke the bedroom door down because she'd locked herself in with the boy. She told me about the way he'd stand over her, just like he tried to stand over me, and tell her that nobody would ever believe her because she was weak. My heart broke for that little boy. Can you imagine being 5 years old and watching that monster roam your hallways? Can you imagine the terror of hearing those heavy boots and knowing that there's no escape? That's not a home, that's a prison. And the man who built it thinks he's a king. I told the audience and I told Elena that we need to stop making excuses for these people. We live in a world that's become too soft on bullies. We want to analyze their trauma, we want to understand their triggers, and we want to give them 10 chances to change. But what about the victims? What about the child who's grown up with the literal marks of a grown man's stress on his skin? Where is the empathy for them? I don't have room for Marcus's excuses. I don't care if he had a bad day or a bad decade. The moment you put your hands on a child, you forfeit your right to understanding. You've crossed the line into a territory where only accountability exists. I've been criticized for being too harsh, for being judgmental. Well, you're damn right I'm judgmental. If we don't judge this, if we don't call this what it is, evil, pure and simple, then we're complicit in it. I look back at the curtain where Marcus had disappeared. He was still out there somewhere, likely trying to convince anyone who would listen that he'd been wronged. That's the most dangerous part of his type. They are the heroes of their own twisted stories. In his mind, he's the victim of a biased show and a faulty machine. He'll go to his grave believing his own lies because the alternative, admitting he's a child abuser, is something his ego can't survive. But I don't need his confession. The marks on that boy's arms are the only confession I need. The way Elena shakes when his name is mentioned is the only testimony I require. I've learned to trust the victim's bodies more than the perpetrator's words. The body doesn't lie. Trauma leaves a map, and Marcus's fingerprints were all over it. I told Elena that today was the day she had to become the hero. I couldn't do it for her. I could give her the stage, I could expose the liar, and I could provide the security, but she had to be the one to sign the papers. She had to be the one to tell the police everything. I told her that Marcus's intimidation only has power if she stays quiet. The moment she speaks, the moment she shares the truth with the authorities, his power evaporates. He's a big fish in a very small, dark pond of his own making. In the ocean of the legal system, he's nothing. He's just another case file, another statistic, another man who thought he was above the law until the handcuffs clicked shut. I saw a change in her then. The fear didn't go away, but a layer of resolve started to form over it. She looked at me and said, "I'm not going back. I can't let him do this anymore." That's the moment of truth that actually matters. It's not the polygraph result. It's the moment the victim decides they are worth more than the abuse. I stood up and addressed the crowd again. I wanted them to understand the gravity of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just reality TV. This was a life and death struggle for a family's future. I told them that if they know Marcus, if they have a neighbor, a brother, or a friend who uses intimidation to hide their cruelty, they have a moral obligation to speak up. Silence is the bully's best friend. Marcus counted on Elena's silence. He counted on the neighbors minding their own business. He counted on me being just another talk show host who wanted a viral clip. He was wrong on all counts. I'm a man of Ranjioid boundaries. I believe there are things you just don't do. You don't lie to cover your tracks when you've hurt someone. You don't try to bully people who are trying to help. And you damn sure don't lay a finger on a child. Marcus broke every one of those rules and then had the audacity to be offended when he was called out. It's a level of narcissism that is truly staggering. But he met his match today. He met a guy who doesn't care about his threats. He met a guy who has spent a lifetime dealing with people much tougher and much more dangerous than he could ever dream of being. I wanted him to feel that. I wanted him to feel small. Because when you strip away the shouting and the posturing, that's all he is. A small, frightened man who can only feel big by making others feel tiny. We brought out our counselor, a woman who specializes in domestic violence recovery, and I watched as she took Elena's hand. This is the part that doesn't always make it into the headlines, the slow, painful work of rebuilding a shattered life. It's not as dramatic as a shouting match, but it's 1,000 times more important. I told Elena I'd be checking in. I told her that my team wouldn't just drop her at the airport and forget her. We were going to follow through. I looked at the camera one last time before we went to break. I didn't have a clever sign off. I just wanted to leave the audience with a simple truth. The truth is a choice. You can live in the light, or you can try to hide in the shadows of your own lies. But eventually, the light is going to find you. And when it does, no amount of shouting is going to save you. I walked off that stage and into the dim light of the hallway, the adrenaline finally starting to cool in my veins. It's a strange feeling, that transition from the high intensity heat of a confrontation back to the quiet reality of the production office. I could still feel the phantom pressure of Marcus's presence, that heavy, aggressive energy he tried so hard to weaponize against me. My knuckles were tight and my neck felt stiff. That's the physical cost of standing your ground against a man who has no boundaries. You don't just walk away from a moment like that and forget it. It stays in your joints for a while, a reminder of the friction between the truth and a desperate lie. I passed one of the security guards, Dan, near the exit. He gave me a silent, weary nod. He didn't have to say anything. We both knew how close Marcus had come to crossing a line he couldn't uncross. Dan told me they had to hold him back one last time near the loading dock because he'd seen a camera and wanted to get one last shout in for the lens. Even at the very end, Marcus was performing. He wasn't worried about his soul or his family. He was worried about how his anger looked to the world. I sat down in my dressing room, the door closed, and for the first time in an hour, it was actually quiet. The roar of the audience and the screeching of Marcus's voice were gone, replaced by the hum of the air conditioning. I sat there in the dark for a minute, just thinking about that little boy. I thought about the bruises I saw in those photos. People often ask me why I get so angry, why I don't just stay calm and read the results like a robot. They don't understand that if you aren't angry about a child being hurt, then you've lost your humanity. My anger isn't a show. It's a response to a world that sometimes forgets to protect the most innocent among us. Marcus tried to intimidate me because he thought I was just a TV guy playing a part. He forgot that before the suits and the cameras, I was a cop who had to look parents in the eye and tell them their children weren't coming home because someone like him couldn't control their temper. He forgot that I've spent decades in the trenches where the truth isn't a debate, it's the difference between life and death. I won't look the other way, not today, not ever. One of my producers knocked on the door and stuck her head in. She told me Elena was in a car headed to a secure location we'd set up. She also told me that the local police had been notified and were waiting for our footage. That's the hoquois, the consequence that Marcus didn't see coming. He thought the stage was a vacuum, a place where he could scream and shout and then just go back to his life. He didn't realize that when you step onto my stage and fail that test, the world doesn't just stop. The gears of justice start turning. He's going to find out very soon that his intimidation tactics don't work on a police sergeant or a judge. He's going to find out that the tough guy routine doesn't get you much respect in a county jail. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction knowing that the shadow he'd cast over Elena's life was finally being dismantled piece by piece. There's a specific kind of silence that follows a guy like Marcus, a silence of exhaustion. Elena was exhausted from the years of fear. The audience was exhausted from witnessing such raw, unfiltered malice. And honestly, I was exhausted too. It takes a lot out of you to stand in the gap and take the hits for someone else. But I'd do it again tomorrow. I'd do it every day for the rest of my life if it meant one less child had to sleep with one eye open. I looked at my reflection in the mirror and I didn't see a celebrity. I saw a man who had done his job. I saw a man who had kept his promise. The truth is a heavy thing to carry, but it's the only thing that allows you to look yourself in the eye at the end of the day. Marcus tried to be the storm, but he didn't realize that I'd been the anchor for a long time. You can't blow me over with a few threats and a puff of the chest. I've seen the real monsters, the ones who don't shout because they don't have to. Marcus was just a loud, scared man clinging to a lie that had already dissolved. As I packed up my bag to head home, I thought about the message this sends. It's not about the fight. It's about the fact that the truth always wins in the end, no matter how hard you try to bury it under a layer of fear. If you are living in a house where fear is the only guest, If you are protecting someone who is hurting the people they should love, you need to understand that silence is not safety. It's a cage. Break the silence before it breaks you. If you know someone is being hurt, or if you are being hurt yourself, reach out. Don't wait for a camera to find you. The truth is your only way out, and there are people out here who will stand with you until the storm passes.